today we're going to cover still chapter 1, section 3. And today what we're going to learn about is the midpoint formula and the distance formula. You will need to memorize the two formulas. I do not give you the formulas because these are two formulas that are not provided on an SAT or a PSAT. So you will need to memorize the formulas. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what a midpoint is. Okay, so a midpoint is a point that divides the segment into two congruent segments. So in this picture, M is the midpoint, and I can tell that it's split this whole segment of JK into two congruent pieces, JM and MK. And I can tell that they're congruent because they both have a measurement of 3. Now you might also be given congruency marks. So they might put the little tick marks on the segment to show that they're congruent as well. So if M is the midpoint of JK, then you know that the length of JM is going to equal the length of MK. So you can either say that the two segments are equal, or if you don't have any measurement on them, you can also say that they are congruent. Now, again, like I said last week, if I draw a segment here, and let's say I call this A, B, C, just by looking at this with no measurements or no markings, I cannot assume that B is right in the middle and it's the midpoint. The only way that I could tell that B would be the midpoint is they would either need to give me congruency marks or tell me how long the segment is. Maybe I told you that the length of AB was 2 and then the length of BC was 2. Then I could state that B was the midpoint. But without any kind of markings or measurements, I cannot assume that B is the midpoint. And the only thing you can assume in geometry, and we're going to see this coming up at the end of the chapter, is when you have a line. This is a straight line, and it's also called a straight angle. But we'll see this coming up towards the end of the chapter. Next, we're going to talk about a segment bisector. And a segment bisector is basically going to be splitting a segment. And it can be a point, it could be an array, a line segment, or a plane that is going to intersect the segment at its midpoint. Now, remember, lines and rays and planes go on forever. So we can never bisect them because we could never find the middle of a line. But we can find that midpoint of a segment. So on the quiz, I'm going to ask you to name the segment bisector. So in this particular picture, we can see that line CD is a segment bisector of segment AB. So that now tells me that since it was bisected and split in half at its midpoint, that segment AM is going to be congruent to segment MB. And that's what is being stated here. And you could either state that they're congruent. In this particular case, that's the statement I would give because I know nothing about the measurement. Now, if they told me that AM was 5 and MB was 5, then I could state that AM is equal to MB because I know how long it is. I know a number. Now, let me draw another example here. Let's say I have another segment here. Let's put an M and a B. And I'm going to add the congruency marks. But this time, my segment bisector is going to be a ray. So in this particular example that was originally on the slide, the segment bisector was a line. Now I could state that AB, or let me do MC, is a segment bisector of, and it's not the line, it's the segment. So I could say that ray MC is a segment bisector of segment AB. Because I was given that AM was congruent to MB. And that's how I can tell it was bisected. In addition, I can tell that M is the midpoint. Next we have a word problem, and it's got a picture here. This is the top of a skateboard. So it says, in the skateboard design, VW, so that segment, bisects segment XY at point T. Then they're also giving us the length of XT. Now, what was nice here, if you zoom into the picture, you see the little red congruency marks? So in addition to the words telling us that it was bisected, we can also see that XT, which has a length of 39.9 centimeters, and because it was bisected, then I can also see that this segment, TY or YT, is also 39.9 centimeters. So if it asked me to find the length of the entire segment made up of from X to Y, I can either find it by just taking 39.9 and add it to itself, or I could do 39.9 times 2. The choice is yours. Either way, when I add it, I'm going to get the same answer. And then here, same thing. So the length of the entire top of that skateboard design is going to be 79.8 centimeters. Now, just a little preview of what's to come as far as proofs go. I'm going to show you sort of what the setup is going to look like. I'm going to turn this word problem into a proof. So if this were a question on the quiz, all I would be looking for you to do is either double the 39.9 or add it to itself. So, but let's say this question turned into a word problem, to a proof. So when we write proofs, we're going to have a statement column and a reason column. Now, when you're given a proof, you're going to be given some type of information. So in this problem, I was given, I could say that the given here was that point T, and this will be spelled out for you. Point T is the midpoint of XY. And then I'm also going to give you that XY or XT is equal to TY, which is equal to 39.9 centimeters. All of this is going to be given information, and that was what was given to us in the word problem. What they want me to try to prove, and they'll give you a proof statement, prove that XY equals 79.8 centimeters. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that midpoint information, and I'm going to state that XY is equal to XT plus TY. And that reason why I can state that is because of my segment, addition, postulate. And I like to abbreviate that as SAP. So I don't have to rewrite those three words every time I use it as a reason and a proof. Now what I'm going to do is, because I was given the length of XT and TY, I'm going to do some substitution. I'm going to take out xt and ty, and I'm going to put what it equals. So now I'm going to show that 39.9 plus 39.9, and this is reason why I can give this statement is the reason of substitution. I substituted xt with the 39.9 and the ty with 39.9, and I put an 8 there. Let me fix that. 39.9. Next, my next statement is going to be to add those 39.9s, and that's how I can get it to the 79.8 centimeters. And my reason is add, or you can also say simplify. So this is just a little preview of what's to come in the future, where you're going to have to take all of your knowledge that I teach you and come up with a logical set of statements and then be able to justify those statements with the reasons. And the reasons are going to be definitions, postulates, theorems, and different things like that. Now, I'll ease you into the proofs, but just know that these are coming, and this is what makes the honors class more challenging than the regular geometry class. The regular geometry class doesn't have to write proofs. This is more of a higher level critical thinking process. And what we're doing is trying to develop that critical thinking for you, so when you get to that AP calculus class, you're ready for those more challenging questions. So for example 2, they're telling us that point M is the midpoint of that segment VW, and they want us to find the length of VM. So here is where we're tying in our algebra skills. So because they told us that M is the midpoint, and they also gave us congruency marks, I can see that VM is congruent to MW because M here is the midpoint. So because M is the midpoint, VM is going to be congruent to MW. And this is what I'm going to be setting up using the expression that they gave me for each of these. So VM is 4x minus 1. MW is 3x plus 3. I'm going to solve this algebraically by moving my variables to one side of the equation, and then I'll move the constants to the other. I'll add 1 to both sides, and x equals 4. Now, you need to be very careful when you're taking the tests and the quizzes and doing your homework that you read what it's asking for. Too many times when I go to grade a quiz, if this were a question, everybody gives me x equals 4. But if you go back, I didn't ask for x, I asked for the length of VM. So now that we have the value of x, now we have to substitute in our value of x into the expression for VM. So VM was the 4x minus 1. I'm now going to take my newly found value of x, plug it in, 4 times 4 minus 1, 16 minus 1, and I get 15. So the value or the length of VM equals 15. Now, the way that I change different versions of a quiz or a test in this class, let's say instead of asking you to find VM, I could have said find MW. So the person next to you, their quiz may say find VM, but then the other person might have MW. Or I might have also asked you to find the length of VW, the whole thing. So then what you would have needed to remember is that these are congruent. So if this one's 15, this one's 15, so the length of the whole thing, VW, is going to be 30. So make sure you read the questions carefully. This is what happens on standardized tests as well, that you read specifically what I'm asking for. So the midpoint formula, what we're going to be doing is taking two ordered pairs or two coordinates, and we're going to find where the middle of that is. Now, all we're basically doing is finding an average. We're going to add the x's together and add the y's together and then divide them both by 2. So your answer is always going to be an ordered pair or a coordinate. Now, notice the little 1s and 2s. So this x1, y1 right here, this is just like a label, the little 1. So this is ordered pair number 1. This could be ordered pair number 2. And when you want to find the midpoint, you're just going to take the two x coordinates, you're going to add them, and divide by 2. Then you're going to take the two y's, add them, divide by 2. This is going to give you the x of your midpoint, and this will give you the y of your midpoint. And those little subscripts are just like labels for me. So that's how I'll tell what coordinate is an endpoint and which one is a midpoint. You're going to need to memorize this formula for the quiz on Wednesday. Okay, so here is our example. It says the endpoints of RS are the ordered pair for R is 1, -3, and S is 4, 2. Now, I'm going to go ahead and label with the x1, y1, and the x2, y2. So I'm going to say ordered pair R is going to be my ordered pair number 1. So I'm going to say that this is x1, y1. It doesn't matter which one you label as ordered pair 1 and which one is ordered pair number 2. Just makes it easier. Now, on the quiz, I'm not going to be giving you this picture. I'm only going to give you the sentence. So obviously, if I gave you this graph, you could figure out what that ordered pair is just by looking at the graph. But I will not give you the graph. You will have to use the formula. So again, just to review, and if it helps you to write it down multiple times, remember your midpoint formula. You're finding the average of the x's. So you're adding x1 plus x2, divide by 2. Remember, this is going to give you the x of your midpoint. And then y1 plus y2, divide by 2, will give you the y of the midpoint. And then when you go to write your answer, remember it's going to be an ordered pair or a coordinate. So let me go ahead and fill in my numbers. So I'm going to be filling in my x1, which is 1. And then I'm going to fill in my my x2, which is 4. And then I divide by 2. And then I get 5 over 2. This is your x of your midpoint. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the y of the midpoint. -3 plus 2. And then I divide it by 2. And I end up with -1/2. And this is the y of my midpoint. So now I'm going to go ahead and write it as a coordinate. 5 over 2 and -1/2. Now, if you were graphing this, I'm okay with you leaving it improper, but if you had to actually plot this point, I would change the 5 over 2 and either make it a mixed number or make it a decimal, 2.5, and then this one, -0.5. On the quiz, all 3 would be acceptable answers. Once we start the online homework, make sure you read how they want you to input it into your iPad, whether they want it left as a fraction, decimal, or mixed number. They will specify when we start the online homework. But for right now, when you're doing tonight's homework and on the quiz, I would accept either one of these 3 versions of this answer. Next, again, make sure you're reading what's given. This time, they're giving us the midpoint and one of the endpoints. They want us to find the coordinate of the other endpoint. And again, I will not give you a picture like this. I'm just going to give you the sentence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the formula and I'm going to replace my given. So remember, I like to label the midpoint as my x of my midpoint and the y. So that'll be my x, m, y, m. And then I'm going to say j. I'm just going to say that this is going to be my order pair number 1. And now I'm going to replace these 4 numbers into the formula. And again, the formula again, and again, you don't need to write it down. Just make sure you memorize it. So this is the first formula I'm working with, the first part of it, and then the y1, y2, divide by 2 equals the y of the midpoint. So let me go ahead and replace the numbers that were given to me. So I'm going to go ahead and replace my x1 with a 1. And then I'm also replacing the xm with the 2. So I'm going to go ahead and put 1 plus x sub 2 divide by 2. So that little 2 there on that x is just a little label. And then the x of my midpoint was a positive 2. Now I need to solve for this variable right here. So I'm going to use my algebra skills. First thing I'm going to do is multiply both sides by this denominator of 2 to cancel it out of the bottom of the fraction. And now I'm left with 1 plus x sub 2 equals 4. The next thing I need to do is subtract the 1. And the x of my endpoint so far is 3. Now I got to go back and do the same thing to find the y of the endpoint. So now I'm going to replace what I have. So I'm going to go ahead and replace, get some other colors here. So this y of the midpoint is going to go right here. And then my y1 is going to come from here. So let's replace. So I have 4 plus y sub 2 divided by 2 equals that y of the midpoint, which is a 1. And now I'm going to use my Algebra 1 skills. I need to multiply both sides by 2 to cancel out my fraction. So get rid of the denominator. And now I am ending up with 4 plus y sub 2 equals 2. Subtract the 4 from both sides. Y sub 2 equals negative 2. We're going to put both of these answers and list them as an order pair. So the answer for the coordinate of k, so endpoint k, is the order pair positive 3, negative 2. Okay, so this is the formula for calculating a distance. And again, I'm going to use those little subscripts. So I'm dealing with order pair number 1, order pair number 2, and then I just plug them into the formula. Now, when we were doing lengths of segments prior to this lesson, all of the segments that we had graphed were either horizontal or vertical lines, and then we could have just counted the little squares. What the distance formula is going to calculate is this segment that's going to be diagonal. When it's diagonal like that, you can't just count the little boxes. You have to use the formula. Now you can also use the formula when it's horizontal and vertical. Just know that when you go to subtract either your x's or your y's, you're going to end up getting a 0. So let's go ahead and try an example. So again, I'm not going to give you it graphed. I'm just going to give you the order pairs. I'm going to ask you to calculate the distance. you are going to be leaving your answers in simplest radical form. I'm going to do a couple of examples showing you how to break down square roots without a calculator. So let's do the first one. Again, it helps me to label. This will be my order pair number 1. So I'm going to label this one as x1, y1, and this will be my x2, y2. I'm going to plug it into the formula. Remember, the formula is x sub 2 minus x sub 1 squared plus y sub 2 minus y sub 1 squared. So the midpoint, you add the x's and divide by 2. The distance, you subtract them. So let's plug in our numbers into the formula. So I'm going to go ahead and take my x sub 2, so 7 minus 13. And then this is squared plus, now I do the y's. So I have 10 minus 2 squared, and then it's under a radical. I need to subtract. I now need to square 36 plus 64. I now need to add, and then square root. So the final answer here, the distance between those two order pairs is 10. You should memorize the perfect squares up to 20. When I used to teach Algebra 1, I would tell my students, you should already know up to 12. 12 times 12, 144 from 3rd grade. So just a matter of going up to 20. Now, if you don't know them, you can quickly multiply, 13 times 13 or 14 times 14. But be able to recognize them. Be also be able to recognize when it's not a perfect square, like the next one. So again, I'm going to do the same thing. Order pair number 1, x1, y1, x2, y2. I'm going to subtract them. So I'm going to do 4 minus 2, and it's squared. Then I do the y's, negative 1 minus 3 squared, and it's under the radical. So subtract, square, 2 times 2 is 4, negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16, and now once I add, I get the square root of 20. 20 is not a perfect square. I want you to leave your answer in simplest radical form. So what we're going to do here is a factor tree. And I'm going to break down this radical. Now it doesn't matter if I start with 2 times 10, 4 times 5. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to do 4 times 5. I'm going to keep breaking it down till it's prime. Now if you would have recognized that 4 was a perfect square, you could have just square rooted it. But if you're not certain, keep breaking it down till you have all prime factors. And then what you're going to do is look for a pair. I have a pair of 2's. You bring one of the 2's out of the radical, and anything that doesn't pair up stays underneath. This is something you should have been taught in Algebra 1, how to simplify non-perfect squares without a calculator. We will be doing this all year long, so make sure you understand how to do it. So the final answer here, in simplest radical form, is 2 times the square root of 5. On the quiz, if you blank out, as long as you've shown all your work, and maybe you got it to here, and you weren't sure how to break it down, you will get some points, some partial credit. So it's very important that you're always showing your work. So let's say we need some more practice of breaking down square roots. Let's say the final answer was the square root of 75. Now, I can either choose to say I know that 75 is 25 times 3 or 15 times 5. Now, if you're good and you recognize 25 is a perfect square, you could automatically square root it, and then 3 can't be broken down and you're done. But let's say you said, I didn't want to do 25 times 3. I wanted to do 15 times 5. So then now we got to keep breaking 15 down. It's not prime. So 3 times 5, and then I still have that 5. And now I have all prime factors. I got a pair of 5s. When you make a pair, it comes out of the radical, and anything that doesn't have a pair stays underneath. Notice I got the same answer no matter how I started my factor tree. Let's try another one. Let's try 48. So 48, there's a bunch of ways to break down 48. I could do 2 times 24. I could do 3 times 16. Let's just do 6 times 8. Just one more quick little example. 2 and 3, 2 and 4. Now watch what happens when you make more than one pair. 2 and 2. I got a pair of 2s. So one of these comes out. Then I have another pair of 2s. Another one comes out. And the 3 stays under the radical. So 4 square root 3.